What was your rank, secretary? The whole table laughed. I smiled because I'd heard worse from better men. Then a retired 3-star Army general stopped eating, turned in his chair, and stared at me like he'd just seen a ghost. That was the moment everything started. Not when my brother-in-law made the joke. Not when the general recognized me. The real beginning happened much earlier that day, around 7 in the morning, when I was helping my father climb into my truck outside his house in Decatur, Alabama. "Damn knees," he muttered. He always blamed his knees. Not the arthritis, not the fact that he'd spent 40 years crawling under diesel engines. Just his knees. My father, Earl Quinn, was 73 and stubborn enough to argue with gravity itself. "Easy," I said, keeping one hand on his elbow. I got it. He clearly didn't. But arguing with him was like arguing with weather. You weren't going to win. I got him settled into the passenger seat and drove him to a VA appointment in Huntsville. The waiting room was packed with veterans. Some sat quietly. Some talked about fishing. Some compared medications the way teenagers compare sports stats. Getting older seemed to come with an entire new vocabulary. Blood pressure, joint replacements, physical therapy, sleep studies. My father complained about all of it. Then he complained about the coffee. Then he complained about the parking lot. Honestly, hearing him complain was comforting. It meant he was still fighting. By the time I dropped him back home and headed toward my own house, I was already tired. My husband Tom met me at the door. "Still on for tonight?" he asked. I knew exactly what he meant. His father's birthday dinner. 75th birthday. Big family gathering. Restaurant downtown. Too many people. Too many opinions. And unfortunately, too much Kevin. Kevin Caldwell was Tom's older brother. If confidence could be bottled and sold, Kevin would have been a billionaire. He sold commercial insurance and somehow managed to turn every conversation into a speech about himself. The worst part wasn't that he liked attention. It was that he liked audiences. Family dinners were his favorite stage. "Maybe he'll be in a good mood," Tom said. I looked at him. He laughed. "Yeah, I didn't believe it either." Around 6:30 that evening, we arrived at Cotton Row. The restaurant sat right in downtown Huntsville, warm lighting spilling across polished wood floors. The smell of steak and roasted garlic floated through the dining room. Tom's parents were already there. His sister Diane was there, several cousins, a few family friends, and Kevin, of course. Kevin stood the second we walked in, not because he was happy to see us, because he was in the middle of telling a story and needed a larger audience. "Tom," he shouted. Half the restaurant probably heard him. We sat down. For the first 20 minutes, everything stayed relatively peaceful. People talked about grandkids, retirement, property taxes, football, the usual. Then somebody asked me how retirement was treating me. That was all Kevin needed. "Retirement," he said. "You weren't old enough to retire." A couple people chuckled. "I left active duty," I said. "Same difference." I smiled politely. Tom took a sip of water. I recognized that look. He was already preparing for impact. Kevin leaned back in his chair. "So what exactly did you do in the Army?" There it was. The question. People ask that question all the time. Usually they're curious. Kevin wasn't curious. Kevin was hunting. Mostly flew helicopters. Helicopters. He sounded disappointed, like he'd expected a less interesting answer. "Blackhawks." "Oh." He nodded dramatically. Then he grinned. "So what was your rank?" I could already feel where this was heading. "Why?" "Just wondering." "No, you aren't." The table laughed. Kevin pointed at me. "See, that's what I'm talking about." "What?" "You always answer questions with questions." I learned from professionals. More laughter. For a moment, I thought maybe we'd move on. Instead, Kevin took another sip of beer. Then he fired the shot. "What was your rank, secretary?" The table exploded. Not everyone, but enough. A few cousins laughed. A family friend nearly spit out his drink. Kevin looked delighted with himself. Tom immediately set down his fork. "Kevin," I touched his wrist. "Let it go." I wasn't embarrassed. Honestly, I was tired. Tired people don't waste energy on every insult. I smiled. Then I said the first thing that came into my head. People usually stood when I entered the room. The laughter doubled. Kevin slapped the table. Oh, that's good. A couple people shook their heads. Someone said, listen to her. I just picked up my water glass. Across the room, a server accidentally dropped a tray. Plates clattered. Several people jumped. Without thinking, I looked over and said, easy. Breathe first, then move. The young server froze for a second, took a breath, then started cleaning up. Problem solved. I turned back toward the table and noticed something strange. An older man at a nearby table was staring at me. Not casually. Not because he'd overheard the joke. He was staring the way people stare when they're trying to remember something. His silver-haired wife said something to him. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly pushed his chair back. The room suddenly felt smaller. The man stood, tall, straight-backed, despite his age. There was something familiar about him. Not personally, professionally. Like seeing an old photograph you haven't looked at in years. He walked toward our table. Kevin noticed him first. His grin faded. The man stopped beside us. For a few seconds he simply looked at me. Then he smiled. Not a big smile. The kind that comes from certainty. Havoc. Every muscle in my body locked up. Nobody at the table understood why. But I did. I hadn't heard that call sign spoken aloud in years. The man studied my face. Then he asked quietly, "Are you still using that call sign?" The restaurant noise seemed to disappear. Kevin stopped smiling. Tom looked confused. My heart was suddenly beating much faster than it should have been, because standing beside our table was retired Lieutenant General Frank Holloway, and somehow after all these years he remembered me. The past I'd spent years avoiding had just walked into my dinner, and it wasn't leaving. I didn't answer General Holloway right away. For a few seconds, I just sat there with my hand wrapped around a water glass, feeling the cold sweat gather beneath my fingers. Havoc. That name did not belong in a nice restaurant in downtown Huntsville. It belonged in radio static. It belonged in dust. It belonged in a part of my life I had packed away so carefully I almost convinced myself it stayed packed, because I was healed. That was a lie. Kevin looked from me to the general, then back to me. "Wait," he said. "You two know each other." General Holloway's eyes stayed on mine. We crossed paths. That was such a military answer. Short, clean. Barely anything in it, but heavy enough to bend the table. Tom leaned toward me. "Maris." I could hear the question under my name. "Who is this man? Why does he know you? Why do you look like somebody just opened a grave?" I made myself breathe. "General Holloway," I said. He nodded once. "Ma'am." That one word changed the temperature at the table. Not because he said it loudly. He didn't. But men like Frank Holloway didn't hand out respect for decoration. Even Kevin understood that much. Kevin cleared his throat. "General, huh?" Holloway glanced at him. "Retired." "Right, sure, retired general." Kevin tried to laugh, but it came out thin. Diane, Tom's sister, stared at me with her fork halfway to her mouth. My mother-in-law looked like she had just found out the quiet woman bringing deviled eggs to Easter had once robbed banks. Tom's father, the birthday man himself, sat very still. He was a retired school principal. He knew authority when he saw it. Holloway gave me a small nod. "I didn't mean to interrupt your family dinner." "It's all right," I said, though it wasn't. His wife waved from their table with a gentle smile, clearly used to this sort of thing. Men from the old life, seeing other people from the old life, and forgetting for 1 minute that civilians don't know the rules. Holloway looked like he wanted to say more. He didn't. That was another thing I respected about him. "Good to see you, Colonel Quinn." The title hit the table harder than Kevin's joke had. "Colonel." Nobody laughed that time. Holloway returned to his seat. I stared down at my napkin. Tom's hand found mine under the table again, but this time he didn't squeeze. He just rested it there. Kevin was the first one brave enough or foolish enough to speak. "Colonel." I picked up my fork. "Retired lieutenant colonel, technically." "Technically, it's complicated." Kevin leaned back, blinking like I'd switched languages. "You said you flew helicopters." "I did." You didn't say you were a colonel. You didn't ask with any respect. Tom muttered, "That's fair." A cousin coughed into his napkin to hide a laugh. Kevin's ears went red. The rest of the dinner limped along after that. People tried to talk about normal things, but normal had left the building. Every conversation came with side glances. I could feel questions gathering around me like mosquitoes. What was Havoc? Why did a retired general call her ma'am? Why hadn't she told us? That last one bothered me most because it sounded reasonable. I could have told them. I just hadn't wanted to. On the ride home, Tom kept both hands on the wheel and said nothing until we were past Memorial Parkway. That told me he was choosing his words carefully. Finally, he said, "Were you going to tell me about the call sign? You knew I had one." I knew pilots had call signs. I didn't know yours made retired generals stand up at restaurants. I looked out the passenger window at the strip malls sliding past. A Walgreens, a barbecue place, a church sign advertising Wednesday Bible study, real life, safe life, the kind of life I had fought to get back to. It wasn't like that, I said. Tom glanced at me. Then what was it like? I almost said nothing. I was good at saying nothing. Silence had gotten me through a lot of family dinners, VA hallways, and nights when sleep decided not to show up. But Tom deserved better than a wall. So I told him a little. Not everything. Just enough to open the door. I was a Blackhawk pilot first, I said. Then later I commanded a small aviation rescue task force overseas. Task force. Yes. That sounds bigger than mostly flew helicopters. It was mostly helicopters. He didn't smile. Neither did I. I remembered Fort Novacell before it had that name back, when everyone still called it Rucker. I remembered the heat coming off the tarmac like an oven door. I remembered being 24 and pretending I wasn't scared because the men around me were pretending the same thing. Flight school taught you machines. War taught you people. You learned who panicked quietly, who joked too much, who needed a hand on the shoulder, who lied and said, "I'm good," when they were anything but. My first deployment changed my voice. Not all at once, just little by little. I stopped wasting words. I stopped mistaking loud for strong. And then came the night that made Havoc stick. I still don't like telling it. There had been a sandstorm, the kind that turned the world brown and mean. Visibility was garbage. Communications kept breaking. A small unit outside the safe zone had wounded men, and no clean way out. We were supposed to wait. That was the smart answer. That was the answer nobody could get blamed for. But waiting meant men bleeding in the dirt, while everyone protected their careers with procedure. I made the call to go back in. Twice. The second time, even my own crew chief looked at me like I had lost my mind. Maybe I had. We brought people out. Not all of them. That's the part people skip when they call something heroic. They count the saved because it's easier. The ones you didn't get to stay with you standing at the back of every room. Tom listened without interrupting. When I stopped talking, he reached over and placed his hand on my knee. "Why didn't you tell my family?" "Because then I become that," I said. "The story, the uniform, the thing people either admire too much or pick apart." "And what do you want to be?" "Your wife at dinner." He nodded slowly, then said, "They weren't treating you like my wife. They were treating you like a punchline." I didn't have an answer for that. When we got home, I changed out of my dress and washed my face. My hands looked older under the bathroom light than I expected. Not old exactly, just used. There was a small scar near my wrist from a maintenance accident years ago. Another near my thumb from helping Dad fix his porch railing after he insisted he didn't need help, and then absolutely needed help. Not all damage came from war. Some came from family. Some came from love. Before bed, I checked my phone. There was a message from an unknown number. "Colonel Quinn, this is Frank Holloway. Forgive the intrusion tonight. Some stories deserve silence. Some deserve witnesses. Your choice, Havoc." I stared at it until the screen dimmed. Then I locked the phone and set it face down on the nightstand. Across town, though, I didn't know it yet. Kevin Caldwell was still awake, too. typing my name into search bars. Maris Quinn Army. Maris Quinn Pilot. Havoc Blackhawk. He found almost nothing. And men like Kevin don't treat silence as privacy. They treat it as proof. For about a week after the birthday dinner, things were quiet. Too quiet. Looking back, I should have known better. Men like Kevin rarely let go of something once their pride gets tangled up in it. The problem wasn't that General Holloway had recognized me. The problem was that Kevin had watched an entire room stop laughing at his joke. For a guy like him, that kind of thing sticks. The first sign came the following Sunday. Tom and I were invited to a family cookout at Diane's house in Madison. Nothing fancy. Hamburgers. Potato salad. Kids running through sprinklers. The kind of afternoon Alabama does well. My father didn't come. His knees were acting up, and he'd already informed me that spending 2 hours around that loud insurance salesman counted as a medical emergency. Honestly, I couldn't argue. The minute Tom and I walked into the backyard, I noticed Kevin sitting under the patio umbrella with his phone. Not unusual. Kevin treated his phone like a second wife. What was unusual was the look on his face. He looked frustrated, like somebody had handed him a puzzle and hidden half the pieces. He barely said hello. Instead, he spent most of the afternoon scrolling through something while pretending not to. About 40 minutes in, he finally struck. "So, Maris." I looked up from helping Diane carry a tray of iced tea. "What?" Kevin grinned. Not his normal grin. This one had work behind it. "I've been reading." "That's encouraging." A few people laughed. Kevin ignored them. "I searched your military background." Tom sighed. Actually sighed. The kind of sigh that comes from a man who already knows exactly where this conversation is headed. Kevin continued. "Not much out there." "No." "Kind of strange." "Not really." "You'd think there'd be more." I took a sip of tea. "You'd think?" The smile disappeared from his face. Because I wasn't giving him anything. That frustrated him more than if I'd argued. People like Kevin feed on reactions. Silence is starvation. A few minutes later, he tried again. "So what exactly did this General Holloway guy know you from?" "Work." The cousins laughed. Kevin did not. "You're funny." "So I've been told." Tom nearly choked on his drink. That helped my mood more than it should have. Unfortunately, Kevin wasn't finished. Not even close. As the afternoon wore on, I started noticing little things. Comments. Questions. Tiny seeds. Nothing big enough to challenge directly, but enough to make people wonder. Kevin told one cousin that military records were easy to exaggerate. He told another that lots of veterans accidentally made stories bigger over time. He asked Diane if she'd ever actually seen any proof of my rank. It wasn't open hostility. It was something more effective. Doubt. That's how rumors work. Not with accusations. With questions. By sunset, I could practically hear them moving through the family. Not because anyone believed Kevin. Because uncertainty is contagious. Especially in families. That night, Tom and I drove home in silence for several miles. Finally, he shook his head. "I can't believe him." I stared out the window. "Oh, I can." "He spent an entire afternoon trying to investigate you." "He's investigating himself." Tom glanced over. "What does that mean?" "It means he's trying to figure out why a retired general knew my name." Tom thought about that, then nodded slowly. "Yeah. Kevin doesn't actually care about my military career." "He doesn't?" "No." I looked out at the headlights passing in the opposite lane. "He cares about being wrong." That landed. Because Tom knew his brother. Everybody knew his brother. Kevin could survive embarrassment. What he couldn't survive was uncertainty. The next few weeks only made things worse. Kevin became obsessed. I didn't know the full extent of it until later. But pieces started reaching me. One afternoon, Diane called. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Did Kevin contact one of your old units?" I nearly dropped my coffee. "What?" "He says he's trying to verify information." I closed my eyes. Of course he was. Apparently Kevin had joined multiple veteran Facebook groups. He'd been digging through archived military newsletters, old local newspaper databases, public reunion pages, anything connected to Army aviation. Most of what he found made no sense to him. which somehow made him more determined. The less information he uncovered, the more convinced he became that there had to be something hidden. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found Tom staring at his phone. "What?" He turned the screen toward me. Family group chat. Kevin had posted, "Funny how some military stories get more mysterious every time someone asks for proof." Underneath it sat 3 laughing emojis. Nobody had responded. Not even Diane. Tom looked angry. I felt something different. Tired. Just tired. Because I knew exactly what Kevin was doing. He wasn't looking for truth. He was trying to force me into defending myself. And the second I started defending myself, he could turn it into a debate. I refused to play. The following Tuesday, I drove to my father's house after work. He was sitting in his recliner watching an old Western. The volume was loud enough to qualify as artillery support. "You're deaf." "I'm old." "Same difference." He laughed. I sat beside him. For a while, we watched cowboys ride horses through terrain no horse would ever voluntarily cross. Eventually, Dad grunted while trying to stand. I immediately moved to help. He waved me off, failed, then accepted the help anyway. One thing about getting older, eventually reality wins. Once he was standing, he rubbed his knees. "Body hurts," he snorted. "Getting old is just your own body charging rent." I laughed. He wasn't wrong. As we moved toward the kitchen, he suddenly looked at me. "You okay?" I hesitated. That was all it took. Parents know, even when they're pretending not to. "Kevin?" Dad rolled his eyes. "Ah." That single syllable somehow contained an entire opinion. I sat at the table and explained everything. The restaurant, the general, the rumors, the family gossip. Dad listened quietly. When I finished, he reached for his coffee mug. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "You spent years flying into dangerous places." "That's not funny." "No." He pointed toward me. "What's funny is that one loudmouth at a barbecue gets under your skin worse than enemy fire." I laughed despite myself, because there was truth in it. After a moment, Dad's expression softened. "People can only shrink you if you hand them the ruler." That stayed with me. Later that night after I got home, my phone buzzed. A text message. "Frank Holloway. Some stories deserve silence. Some deserve witnesses. Your choice, Havoc." I stared at the screen. The same message. Simple. Direct. No pressure. Just a reminder. For a long time, I sat alone in the dark living room, thinking. Because for years, I'd convinced myself I was protecting my peace. Maybe I was. Or maybe I'd been letting people rewrite my story because correcting them felt exhausting. Across town, Kevin was still searching, still digging, still feeding an obsession he couldn't control. And for the first time, I realized something important. This wasn't going to stop on its own. About 2 weeks later, Kevin finally found what he thought was his smoking gun. The funny thing about people who are determined to prove they're right is that they often stop paying attention to what they're actually finding. They only see what they want to see. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in the waiting area of a physical therapy clinic while my father worked through exercises his doctor insisted would help his knees. Dad hated physical therapy, not because it hurt, because the therapist was 28 years old and kept calling him Sir. Dad claimed nobody under 40 should be allowed to call anyone Sir. I was halfway through a magazine article I wasn't really reading when my phone buzzed. Family group chat. Kevin. I immediately considered ignoring it. I should have. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. There was a photo. Old. Grainy. Sun-faded. The kind of image that had probably lived in a filing cabinet before eventually being scanned into some forgotten military archive. I stared at it. A younger version of me stood beside a Blackhawk helicopter. Flight suit. Captain Bars. Hair tucked beneath a helmet bag slung over one shoulder. The picture had been taken long before the gray hairs I'd recently started noticing, long before the sleepless nights, long before my father needed help standing up. Kevin had attached a message. Found it. Looks like Maris really did fly helicopters. Still doesn't explain why people supposedly stood when she entered a room. A few minutes later, another message appeared. Strange thing is, this is the only photo I can find. almost like somebody wants the rest hidden. I rubbed my forehead. Tom would later call this phase, Kevin discovers the internet. The problem was that Kevin didn't understand what he was looking at. The photo wasn't important. The caption was, a few minutes later, another notification appeared. This one from Mason, Kevin's son, 19 years old. Smart kid. Much smarter than his father realized. Mason had zoomed in. The caption beneath the photo read, Captain Maris Quinn, Task Force Nightjar. Then Mason wrote, What's Task Force Nightjar? Nobody answered immediately. I certainly wasn't going to, but I knew exactly what would happen next. Mason would search, and unlike his father, he'd actually read what he found. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed again. Another message. This time from Mason. Found an old article. Not much information. Names redacted. But it talks about a female aviation commander during a rescue operation. The group chat suddenly came alive. Diane responded first. What rescue operation? Mason pasted a screenshot. Most of the article was blacked out, but one sentence remained visible. Credited with preventing catastrophic loss of life during severe weather conditions. I stared at the words. 15 years later, and they still made my stomach tighten. Because newspaper articles always sounded cleaner than reality. Reality had looked like fear. Reality had sounded like rotor blades shaking through a sandstorm. Reality had involved young men trying very hard not to die. Kevin responded almost immediately. Could be anybody, Mason answered. Then why are you spending so much time trying to prove it wasn't Aunt Maris? I actually laughed out loud. Several people in the waiting room looked over. I didn't care. For the first time, Kevin wasn't controlling the conversation. Mason had accidentally stepped on the weak spot in his argument. Dad shuffled back into the waiting room a few minutes later. The therapist looked exhausted. Dad looked victorious. How'd it go? I asked. I survived. That's not what I asked. It's what matters. The therapist smiled. I'll see you next week, Earl. Dad groaned like she'd sentenced him to prison. On the drive home, he noticed I was smiling. What happened? Kevin found an old photo. Dad rolled his eyes. Still digging. Apparently. How's that working out? Not great. Dad chuckled. Good. A few minutes later, he became serious. You know what bothers him, right? I kept my eyes on the road. Tell me. He needs there to be a trick. What do you mean? Dad leaned back carefully. People like Kevin are comfortable if somebody got lucky. I glanced over. He continued. They're comfortable if somebody cheated. Another pause. They're comfortable if somebody exaggerated. I knew where he was going. They're uncomfortable if somebody earned something they can't understand. That sat between us for several miles, because Dad was right. Kevin wasn't searching for facts anymore. He was searching for an explanation that protected his ego. That evening after dropping Dad off, I returned home. Tom was sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop open. He looked up. Your fan club is active today. I laughed. Mason. Tom turned the screen toward me. He had the family chat open. The conversation had evolved into a small civil war. Half the family thought Kevin was being ridiculous. The other half wanted more information. Kevin kept insisting there wasn't enough proof. Tom shook his head. It's becoming embarrassing. For who? Not you. I poured myself a glass of iced tea. Before I could sit down, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. Hello. Maris. General Holloway. I immediately straightened. Not because he expected it. Old habits. General. I heard Kevin Caldwell is conducting his own intelligence operation. I laughed. The man sounded amused. Word travels fast. It does in Army aviation. I sat down. What can I do for you, sir? There was a brief pause. Then his tone shifted. More serious. The museum event is next month. I knew immediately what event he meant. The annual aviation commemoration at Fort Novosel. I'd declined every invitation for years. Every single one. I remember. Dale Whitcomb asked if you'd be attending. I closed my eyes. Dale. I hadn't heard his name in months. Maybe longer. One of the men from that night. One of the survivors. How's he doing? Another pause. The kind people use when they don't want to lie. Not as well as he'd like. I looked out the kitchen window. The sun was setting behind the trees. Orange light, long shadows, time moving forward whether we liked it or not. Maris Holloway said quietly, "Yes, sir." He doesn't have many trips left in him. The words landed harder than I expected. After we hung up, I sat alone for a long time. Later that evening, I drove over to Dad's house. We sat together on his porch. No television, no distractions, just crickets and fading sunlight. Eventually, I told him about the call. The museum, Dale, the invitation. Dad listened quietly. Then he struggled to his feet. Not dramatically. Just the slow, careful process of a man negotiating with aging joints. Watching him stand took almost 30 seconds. It struck me then, nobody gets unlimited tomorrows. Not Dale. Not Dad. Not me. Dad finally settled back into his chair. "You going?" I stared into the yard. "I don't know." He nodded, then said the thing that made the decision for me. "Sometimes you don't show up for yourself." I looked at him. He shrugged. "Sometimes you show up because somebody else needs you there." A week later, I called General Holloway. "I'm coming." Across town, Kevin eventually learned about the event through Mason, and when he heard I would be there, he made a decision too. He told everyone he was going. Officially, he claimed he wanted to support family. Unofficially, he still believed he was going to catch me in a lie. What he didn't understand was that the truth had already started moving toward him, and there was no stopping it now. The morning of the ceremony, I almost didn't go. That's the truth. Not the dramatic version, not the movie version, the real version. I stood in my bedroom holding 2 dresses and wondering whether it would be easier to stay home. Tom was adjusting his tie in the bathroom mirror. "You've changed outfits 3 times. "Twice." 3. I sighed. "You're counting." "I've been married to you for 14 years. Of course I'm counting." That got a smile out of me. Barely. But it helped. The event was being held at the U.S. Army Aviation Museum near Fort Novosel. I hadn't been back for one of these ceremonies in years. Every invitation had gone straight into a drawer, then eventually into the trash. Not because I hated the people. I hated the memories. There's a difference. By the time we left Huntsville, the sky was clear and bright. Dad rode with us. His cane was wedged awkwardly between the seats. The entire drive south he complained about traffic, then gas prices, then construction, then traffic again. Some things never change. Around 10:30 we pulled into the museum parking lot. Rows of vehicles already filled the lot. Pickup trucks, SUVs, a few motorcycles, mostly older veterans and their families. People moving slower than they once did. People carrying years in their shoulders, their knees, their backs. The invisible inventory of age. Dad climbed out carefully. Tom immediately moved to help. Dad pretended he didn't need it. Accepted it anyway. That was progress. As we approached the building, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear exactly. Something closer to anticipation. Like standing outside a room you've avoided for years. Inside, volunteers were greeting guests. Old photographs lined the walls. Aircraft displays stretched across the museum floor. History frozen beneath bright lights. And somehow the smell was exactly the same. Metal. Coffee. Old stories. General Holloway found us within minutes. He looked older than he had at the restaurant. Not weaker. Just older. The difference matters. "Maris." "Sir?" He smiled. "You came." "I did." He looked at my father. "Mr. Quinn." Dad shook his hand. "Frank." That surprised me. Apparently they'd met before. Dad noticed my expression. "What? How do you know each other?" Dad shrugged. "We've had coffee." I stared at him. "When?" "You're not the only person who knows veterans." That somehow made perfect sense. The ceremony began shortly before noon. About 100 people gathered in a large hall. Families, veterans, museum staff, a few local reporters. Nothing huge, nothing flashy, just people remembering. I took a seat beside Tom and Dad. Several rows behind us I spotted Kevin. Of course. His wife sat beside him. Mason sat on the other side. Kevin looked uncomfortable, not because anyone was bothering him, because he was surrounded by something he couldn't control. History. The program started with introductions, then recognition of several units, then stories. Simple stories, human stories, the kind that never make headlines. An older veteran talking about missing his best friend, a widow sharing photographs, a grandson describing the grandfather he barely knew. The room stayed quiet, respectful, real. Then General Holloway stepped to the podium. The room settled immediately. He didn't need a microphone to command attention. Some habits survive retirement. He spoke briefly about service, about responsibility, about memory. Then he looked toward me. My stomach dropped. I knew that look. I'd seen it years ago before mission briefings. The man was about to make a decision. 15 years ago. He said, a rescue operation took place during conditions most people would have called impossible. The room grew still. I already wanted to disappear. Instead, Holloway continued. Many people contributed to that mission. Thank God. At least he wasn't turning it into a one-person legend. Because it never was. Then he said, one officer helped ensure a lot of young soldiers got the chance to become old men. Silence. My chest tightened. Holloway looked directly at me. Maris Quinn. I closed my eyes briefly, then stood. The entire room rose with me. Every person, every veteran, every family member, every guest. The sound of chairs moving echoed across the hall. I froze. For a second, I genuinely didn't know what to do. I wasn't prepared for that. I wasn't prepared for any of it. When I finally looked around, I saw Tom standing. Dad standing with both hands gripping his cane. Veterans standing. People I didn't even know standing. And several rows back. Kevin, standing too. The room remained on its feet for several long seconds. Not applause. Not cheering. Just respect. Somehow that felt bigger. Eventually everyone sat. I did too. My hands were shaking. The ceremony continued. Then General Holloway invited another speaker forward. An older man with a cane. Gray hair. Weathered face. Slow steps. Dale Whitcomb. I hadn't seen him in almost a decade. The last time we'd met, he'd still been able to walk without assistance. Age catches everybody eventually. Dale reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, looked toward me, then smiled. Well, he said, this is awkward. The room laughed softly. Dale pointed at me. She hates this. More laughter. I covered my face. He wasn't wrong. Then his expression changed. Not sad. Not dramatic. Honest. I got to grow old because she came back for us. No speech could compete with that. The room fell silent. Dale rested both hands on his cane. Believe me, he said, getting old hurts. A few veterans laughed knowingly. Dale grinned. But it beats the alternative. The room laughed again, then grew quiet. Because everyone understood. Dale sat down. The next speaker surprised me. Carol Sweeney, the mother of one of the soldiers from that mission. I hadn't expected her. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Carol approached the podium carrying a photograph. A young man in uniform smiled from the frame. Her son, Michael, 23 years old forever. Carol looked toward me. Her eyes were kind, which somehow hurt more. You brought my son home. The room became completely silent. I stared at the floor. Carol continued, not alive. The words landed gently, which made them harder. But you brought him home. I felt tears building immediately. No chance of stopping them. Carol held up the photograph. I got to bury my boy. Her voice shook slightly. I got answers. Another pause. I got to stop wondering. You could have heard a pin drop. Then Carol looked directly at me. That matters more than people realize. By then I was crying openly. So was half the room. Even Dad was wiping his eyes, though he'd deny it later. One final veteran spoke. A man named Reyes. He walked with a limp. He pointed toward me. You flew back into that storm twice. I looked down. He smiled. Nobody ordered the second trip. Then he sat down. That was it. No grand speech. No dramatic music. Just truth. Finally, Holloway asked if I wanted to say a few words. I walked to the podium. The room blurred slightly. I looked out at the faces. Old friends, families, people carrying their own scars. I took a breath. I was doing my job. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. I wish I could have done more. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Every person on that ground mattered. I swallowed hard. Every person we brought home mattered. A pause, and the people we couldn't save have stayed with me every day since. Silence. Real silence. The kind you earn. Then I stepped away. As I returned to my seat, I noticed Mason looking at his father. Dad. Kevin stared straight ahead. Mason's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Why did you keep saying she was lying? Several nearby heads turned. Kevin's face turned bright red. He opened his mouth, closed it. Nothing came out. For once there wasn't a joke available. General Holloway looked toward him, not angry, just calm. Son, he said quietly. Rank was never the impressive part. Kevin looked up. Responsibility was. Nobody said anything after that. Nobody needed to. The truth had already done all the work. After the ceremony ended, people lingered. That's what happens at events like that. Nobody rushes out. They stand around talking, remembering, comparing stories, laughing about things that probably weren't funny when they happened. For the next hour, I shook hands, answered questions, and hugged people I hadn't seen in years. A few veterans wanted photographs. One woman introduced me to her grandson. Another thanked me for serving. I appreciated all of it. But if I'm being honest, I was exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. The kind of tired that settles into your bones. Eventually, the crowd started thinning out. Tom was talking with General Holloway near one of the aircraft displays. Dad was sitting on a bench pretending his knees didn't hurt. They hurt. Everybody knew it. Including him. He just preferred denial. I stepped outside for some air. The Alabama afternoon had softened into early evening. The parking lot wasn't crowded anymore. A few people were loading walkers into trunks. Others were saying long goodbyes. I stood near Tom's truck and finally let myself breathe. For the first time all day, nobody needed anything from me. That lasted about 30 seconds. Maris, I turned. Kevin, of course. He stood several feet away, hands in his pockets. No audience, no beer, no punchlines, just Kevin. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It felt strange. I'd spent months listening to him talk. Now he seemed unsure how. Finally, he cleared his throat. I didn't know. There it was. The universal apology of people who wish reality had arrived sooner. I looked at him. You didn't ask. His shoulders shifted slightly. I did ask. No. I shook my head. You mocked. The words weren't angry, just true. That seemed to hit him harder. Kevin stared at the pavement. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncomfortable in his own skin. A long silence followed. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. I thought you were making it up. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Kevin nodded. Yeah, I know. He rubbed the back of his neck. I kept thinking there had to be some explanation. There was. He looked up. I shrugged. I was telling the truth. That actually got a small laugh out of him. A sad one. The kind people laugh when they realize they've been fighting reality. Kevin looked toward the museum. You know what bothered me? I waited. When that general recognized you, I said nothing. Kevin continued. It was like everyone suddenly saw you differently. There it was, finally. The real problem. Not helicopters, not military records, not rank, envy, simple, human, ugly. Kevin sighed. I hated that. I know. I felt... He paused, then shook his head. Stupid. That surprised me. Not because I didn't believe it. Because he admitted it. Most people spend years avoiding the truth about themselves. Kevin had accidentally stepped into it. I folded my arms. So instead of dealing with that feeling, he winced. Yeah. We stood there quietly. A breeze moved across the parking lot. Somewhere nearby, a truck engine started. Normal sounds. Normal life. The kind of life I wanted. Kevin finally looked at me. I was wrong. I nodded. You were. I should have left it alone. You should have. Another pause. Then he asked, "What happens now?" That was a fair question. Not because he deserved an answer. Because family always asks it eventually. What now? I thought about it, then answered honestly. I don't need you to admire me. Kevin blinked. I don't... No. I shook my head. I need you to stop tearing people down so you can feel taller. The words hung there between us. He looked away first. Not because he disagreed. Because he couldn't. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then he nodded, slowly, almost reluctantly, like a man signing paperwork he didn't enjoy. Fair. I smiled. A real smile this time. Not the polite version. Not the survival version. The real one. We can start over. Kevin looked surprised. Really? Sure. Then I pointed a finger at him. But not from jokes. He laughed softly. Fair. From respect. He nodded. From respect. That didn't magically fix everything. Life doesn't work that way. Trust takes longer than apologies. But it was a beginning. And sometimes that's enough. A few minutes later, Tom and Dad joined us. Dad immediately looked suspicious. What happened? Nothing. He narrowed his eyes. That's exactly what somebody says when something happened. Tom laughed. Kevin laughed. Even I laughed. And somehow, for the first time in a long while, it felt easy. The drive back to Huntsville was quiet. Not awkward quiet. Comfortable quiet. Dad fell asleep halfway home. His cane rested against the door. One hand folded over his stomach. The years showed more when he slept. The effort. The wear. The small losses age collects. Watching him I realized something. The veterans at the museum. Dale. Carol. General Holloway. My father. All of them carried things. Old injuries. Old grief. Old memories. Some visible. Most invisible. Growing older doesn't erase those things. It just teaches you how to carry them. That evening after dropping Dad off, Tom and I sat on our back porch. The sun had disappeared. Crickets filled the darkness. For a while we simply listened. Then Tom nudged my shoulder. You okay? I thought about the question. The restaurant. The jokes. The rumors. The museum. The apology. The years I'd spent hiding pieces of myself because I didn't want attention. And the strange peace I felt now. Not because strangers stood up for me. Not because Kevin got embarrassed. Not because a room full of people finally knew the truth. Something quieter than that. I smiled. Yeah. Tom squeezed my hand. I looked out into the darkness and realized something I'd missed for years. Respect isn't really about people standing when you enter a room. It's about the people who stay beside you when life gets hard. It's about honesty, responsibility, grace, and sometimes it's about looking a family member in the eye and calmly saying, "You don't get to make me smaller anymore." That night, I slept better than I had in a long time. Not because the past disappeared, because I finally stopped hiding from it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where you're listening from. And if there's a veteran in your family, feel free to share their name in the comments. Some people leave this world twice, once when they're gone, and once when they're forgotten.